everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, 5 Best Practices to Drive Scholarship Dollars into Student Pockets from the University of Arizona. My name is Stacy Matt, and I'm the Product Marketing Manager here at Campus Logic. Before we get started, let's go over a few housekeeping items. You can adjust your audio settings in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. The sound quality is usually best if you dial in from a phone as opposed to using your computer speakers. Please submit questions throughout the webinar by typing into the questions area on your screen. We'll collect them and address them during our Q&A section at the end. We'll also be emailing you a recording of today's webinar. So I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. Ken Downs, the Scholarship Evangelist at Campus Logic, and Carrie Cohen, Project Coordinator at the University of Arizona. Ken is Campus Logic's product evangelist for Scholarship Universe. He is evangelizing how technology and best practices can remove friction for students, schools, and organizations in the scholarship and financial aid space. He was instrumental in leading the development of the University of Arizona's national award-winning Scholarship Universe product, now a key part of Campus Logic's student financial success platform. Ken is a longstanding member of the National Scholarship Providers Association and has given workshops titled Big Data and the Coming Scholarship Sea Change, Scholarship Hacking, Cutting the Gordian Knot, and the Scholarship Universe Story. Carrie Cohen worked in financial aid for 8 years at Pima Community College in Tucson until she joined the scholarship team at the University of Arizona in 2017. She has taken on the role of managing Scholarship Universe processes at the school in addition to her role as a scholarship counselor. Her experience working hands-on with students to help them navigate the process of paying for school has been extremely valuable in her roles at UA. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Ken and Carrie.
Thank you, Stacy, and thank you, Carrie, for joining us today.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
And thank you, everyone, for joining us on this webinar. Here's our agenda for the hour. After we discuss the role of scholarships in the student's education, we're going to talk about the 10 major challenges that staff and students face in scholarships. If you happen to work on the front lines in scholarships, you're essentially the first responders in higher education. So these challenges will be quite familiar to you as you're not running into burning buildings, of course, but you are putting out fires on campus and helping students to stay in school. If you're not working in the day-to-day operations of scholarships, the goal for you hopefully is to walk away from this webinar with a greater understanding of what your colleagues, your staff, and your students are experiencing in the scholarship space. And then, of course, we're going to cover the 5 best scholarship management practices, and sprinkled throughout the talk, we're going to have some results from the University of Arizona. And as Stacy mentioned, we will have some time at the end for some Q&A, so feel free to type in those questions as they come up in the chat. So we are all familiar with how important academic success is. It's been sort of drilled into us since we've been kids, but we're hearing a lot more about the financial piece in higher education and how important that is. Yet there's a grave underinvestment in financial aid and scholarships. So we have some statistics here, and Carrie, that point to how important the role of scholarships play in higher education today. Is there any one of them that sticks out to you?
Well, these statistics are very important, but actually when you're working in scholarships and you hear the student stories, that's where you really feel the big impact. So what we see on the news is all these statistics about, how many students are staying in school and the high cost of education. But the real impact is when we start reading the essays that the students are submitting with their scholarship applications and hearing their stories. And what we're hearing is that we have a lot of students who are first generation students and they want to get an education where their parents weren't able to. And some of them come from single parent homes and single earner homes where they're working multiple jobs to help the family. We hear stories of food insecurity, and those are pretty common where students are talking about needing to choose between their next meal or buying school supplies. So what does that mean? We're looking for the students who have that need to supplement their education with additional money, and that's why scholarships are so crucial in closing the funding gap.
Yeah, and so the essay piece is really important. So we're finding today that students are telling stories in their essays that they may not have told anyone. So if you're a counselor reading an essay, you might be the first person to hear the student's story. And I just heard a statistic last week that 45% of students are food insecure. Partly that's alarming when you see that it's almost 50%. It's really shocking. But then it also makes me wonder if that's actually low, because students aren't necessarily comfortable. I certainly can't imagine going to a financial aid office and revealing, can you help me? I'm food insecure. Can you help me with food? It takes a tremendous amount of courage. So the stories in those essays behind the statistics is really important. It gives you a full picture.
I agree.
So, but if scholarships are so important, and we understand how students are struggling so much today, we hear sometimes that scholarship funds are left on the table or they're going unspent, like this quote here. $100 million is left on the table. And so is that true? Is it scholarships are left?
Believe it or not, that is true, Ken. And I know you have some personal experience with that. Can you share some of that?
Yes. So full disclosure, I had worked at the University of Arizona for 12 years. And in the early years, I was a financial administrator, and then I transitioned to a scholarship counselor. At the time, we had a large team of 2 people, which is large for some scholarship teams. 2 is better than 1. But we were responsible for awarding a few $1 million in scholarships. It also had been building up over the years. And if you've worked in scholarships, you understand that scholarships have unique criteria sometimes. And that information doesn't necessarily live in your student information system. It may not live in admissions. The only way to get answers to that information is to actually ask students those questions. And so we were struggling to award those funds. And in the meantime, not to mention that this was during the recession, so about 2008. And every school has their stories about the recession of there was layoffs and furloughs, so your service is suffering. Parents promised their child that they'd be able to send them to your university. They lose their job, and now they're in your office asking for help, and they don't know what to do. Then donors were also suffering, so we had donors that had been contributing to the university for a few years, and they were no longer able to contribute because they were struggling. So we have all these stories at that time, and our foundation came to us in financial aid and was really upset and did not understand why we weren't spending the scholarship dollars. And it's no fault of theirs, but it reminds me of a quote, and you've heard me say this many times. Warren Buffett has a saying that it's easier to make $1 billion than it is to spend it. And I can relate to that. And everyone laughs when I say that because they focus on the $1 billion part. But let's just substitute that for several $1 million or several $100,000. Working in scholarships when you're awarding is very challenging. As I mentioned, those are unique criteria, and if you have a small team. So our foundation and our advancement didn't understand why we were struggling to award these funds at that particular point in time. Generous donors, a large pool of funds, and a large pool of students, roughly 40,000 to pick from. So it's very difficult to award scholarship funds. And if you're in advancement, you might reflect on that Warren Buffett quote and see it from a different perspective, that actually it should be easy to spend those funds, that the hard work was in raising all of those dollars. So it depends what side you're on. And what's really important and what came out of that time period was basically an inflection point at the university. We had to make some fundamental shifts in how we were managing scholarships at the institution. And so on this slide here, we have fundraising and awarding, and these really go hand in hand. So consider this a bonus practice. It was not part of our 5, but it's really important to develop a partnership between advancement and financial aid.
Right. And just to add to what you were just talking about, you can see here the number one way to undercut future fundraising efforts is to simply not award the funds you've already received. Financial aid is working closely with the advancement, and that's important. At the U of A, we worked really hard to build a relationship with our foundation and make sure that those 2 departments worked well together. We help each other, and all the scholarship stakeholders meet quarterly to ensure the cycle keeps getting better.
Yeah, and so you've sort of carried the torch since I've left the university, and these quarterly stewardship meetings that the foundation holds, and those were really critical for us in developing these best practices. So these practices are not something that we came up with a couple of weeks ago just to give a webinar. They've been in the making for 10 years now, so they've been tested and refined. And the foundation actually was very helpful in giving me a platform to talk about what we were developing and what our goals were to help transform the process at the institution. So it's not just our personal experience here today that we've developed these best practices from, but there's support from a study that was done by the Titan Titan Partners that talked about the friction in higher education and what was preventing funds from reaching students' pockets. And the first one they identified was inefficient financial aid processing systems. So if you work in financial aid, you're familiar with verification. So that's essentially students drop off, they get flagged for something, and there's various reasons why a student might not complete that process and eventually enroll in the institution or stay enrolled. The second problem is poor student communications. So students may not know what you need from them, why you need it, and what's the best way to get it to you. So students might drop off in that process as well. Or they don't know the cost of their education. So on financial aid offers, the complications in that and understanding what an EFC means and all of those things that go on the aid offers is confusing for students. And thirdly, what we're here to talk about today is poor organization of scholarships. So this might mean that there's resources spread across too many places, so it's not efficient for students. They're not going to engage in that process. Or there's irrelevant opportunities, or there's scams, which we're familiar with. So students don't trust the process. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So these challenges, and as I mentioned, the recession amplified things at the University of Arizona. However, those challenges that were existing back then still exist today for institutions across the country. And so we're going to go through those now. And Carrie, you're going to kick us off on the student challenges.
Yeah, so you can see here by this chart that there's challenges for both students and staff. And I just want to talk a little bit about the student challenges. So some of the things that we've seen in our experience with students looking for scholarships is the disjointed search process. So just think about going to Google and typing in scholarships. I mean, you're going to get everything, including the kitchen sink, right? And that ties in with the overwhelming number of irrelevant scholarships. So there's nothing more frustrating than a student going through the time and effort to find a scholarship, start the application process, and somewhere in the middle find out that they aren't even eligible, they don't meet their criteria, or it's just not even relevant. And then also the long and tedious application process. Students are looking for something that's quick and easy. Not saying that they aren't willing to put in the work, but the longer the application is, the more difficult it is, the more likely they're just going to abandon it in the middle and not continue and complete the application. And then transparency is a big one for us because students have complained that, and I've heard in the past students say, well, is this real? Am I really going to get these scholarships? Because I've applied before and I've never heard anything, so I don't even know where they're going. And so transparency helps those students to kind of track that progress, which kind of ties into our last one, is if they have that option to track the progress of their scholarships, they know that it's actually going through a process of being reviewed and a selection process. And then ultimately, hopefully, they can see an award at the end.
So we have a poll for you today. We actually have quite a few polls, but this is our first one. And it's regarding the student challenges here that Carrie just went over. So we want to know, what is the top scholarship challenge for your students at your institution?
So we just talked about these 5 different challenges, and we are interested in knowing which one is which one you're hearing most from your students about. So go ahead and take a couple seconds to put in your answer, and then we'll take a look at the results.
Okay. So looks like number 1 is the disjointed search process, which is not surprising, but we do have a spectrum here of challenges for the student side. Great, thank you everyone. So now we're going to go back to the challenges, and I'm going to talk about the staff challenges. So when you're working in scholarships, you might have to go to multiple systems to verify student information. Most commonly go to your student information system to verify some data that was not provided on the application. You want to verify what the student provided is actually accurate. We're also manual communication. No one enjoys sending manual communications over and over, hounding students to complete an application to let them know it's open. So that's a challenge. Also limited visibility. So if you're a decentralized institution, there's no central process or system in place, you might struggle to promote your scholarships. Most commonly, someone will send out a newsletter, but students get so many emails today, they may or may not pay attention to it or read it, and so that can be a challenge. Data security and compliance, we could throw in implicit bias here as well. So are you providing information to your committees that they shouldn't really see about the student that's not relevant to the selection process? So Carrie, I can remember there was a department when we were developing these practices that was collecting paper applications, and they would literally print a copy for each committee member, so that might be 10 per student, and they were taking whiteout and whiting out certain information before providing it to the committee. That's a terrible use of time and efficiency. So that's another issue that departments or organizations might be struggling with. And then the last one, which we've already touched upon, is low or poor fund utilization. So low fund utilization is pretty obvious. You're just not spending the funds that you have available. But poor fund utilization stems from a pressure to award those funds and not having good practices in place. So you might end up awarding students who are actually not eligible for those funds, which can actually hurt you in the end if a donor realizes that you awarded someone a scholarship that did not meet the criteria that they had intended. So we have another poll. So what is the top scholarship challenge for your staff? I'll just give you again a couple more seconds here to provide your answer.
I feel like it's hard to pick just one.
Yes. But we're forcing you to pick one. Okay. We're going to take a look at the results here. So no surprise.
Not at all.
There's a theme here, low fund utilization. But again, we have a spectrum except for data security and compliance. So I must have did a terrible job of explaining that one. So that's great. Thank you for that feedback. That's helpful for us in this presentation today. So Carrie, if we were to sum up the solution for all of these challenges for an institution, what would that be?
Well, we believe the solution is complete scholarship management. And what does that mean? It's addressing the entire ecosystem of scholarships, starting with the student experience down to reporting and reconciliation. In the 5 practices, we're going to cover addressing the scholarship ecosystem and how to make it more efficient and better for all the stakeholders. That includes the students, the staff, and the donors.
That's great. So the ecosystem is an excellent way to think about the scholarship process at your institution. Another way of looking at it is your scholarship process of business and how well would it be doing. So there's this term called the total addressable market in business. And so we know that 75% of students have financial needs. So that's essentially your market of students that you want to provide access to scholarships for. So how many students on your campus are you actually reaching? Is it 20%? Is it 25%? What do you need to do in order to close that gap and help more students and reach those students? Another way of looking at it is if you're a decentralized institution like the University of Arizona was and still is how many departments are managing scholarships and no one knows how they're managing it. So the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. How many of them can you bring into the fold into a complete scholarship management model? And we're going to get into that a little bit more in the best practices. So drum roll, here are the best practices that we've all been waiting for, the anticipation. But it's important to think about the best practices as, you can of course try to do one of these or 2 of these independently, but you really want to think about these as interdependent. And that phrase reminds me of the book by Stephen Covey, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. He talks about transitioning from an independence to interdependence, and that's a better, it's better for growth, it's better for helping things and maturing and growing. And so we think of that in scholarships. So you essentially could recall this the 5 habits of successful scholarship management. And so they're interrelated. They support one another. And as we're going through these best practices, I think you'll find that there's some overlap and you'll see the connection between them. And so using them in unison will be really helpful. So we have another poll for you. When a student or parent asks for helping in finding scholarships, what resources do you point them to? And I'll place a bet with you, Carrie. Do you think someone out there has a physical binder of scholarships?
Oh, I'm sure they're still out there.
Because when I started in financial aid 12 years ago, part of my orientation was showing me the scholarship binder.
Yeah, yeah. And think of it from a student perspective, having to flip through that binder and try and find scholarships.
And compete it. Can you check it out and take it home? And all those challenges. Eventually, we migrated to a web page of resources, but since then we've gone far and above and beyond that. So. Okay, no binders. So who won that bet? So list or webpage. So that's what's most common. So that is what most institutions are doing they create a web page that has a list of either external resources or in the case when you get emailed those scholarships that come in, you're solicited to post them on your website, so you might post them. But the challenge with that is that students still have to read through those options, and you have to review them all the time. You have to vet them, you have a process to make sure they're legitimate. And then students have to go out to a bunch of different places from those links and review those scholarships or those additional resources. Thank you. So here is our first best practice: offer a one-stop shop. So you want to think of a one-stop shop as essentially a go-to for a service. It's highly focused on something that you're looking for. And so for me personally, I have a personal one-stop shop. It's an app on my phone called Spotify. I can essentially get any phone. I can get any song that I want at any point in time, which is pretty remarkable. So Carrie, how about you? What is your go-to or go-tos in life?
So I think in my personal life, maybe a one-stop shop for me would be going to the mall, because you can get everything you need there. You can go to the coffee shop, you can go to the bookstore, you can even go to the movies now at the mall. But at work at the U of A, my one-stop shop is Scholarship Universe for scholarships.
Excellent. So here is a one-stop shop and some of the things you can do. So Carrie, maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so you can see by this this image that a one-stop shop for scholarships can offer a lot of different things, both to staff and students. Some of my favorite for students, and this is really based on student input on what they're looking for, is being able to apply to multiple types of scholarships. So maybe they go in and they're going to apply to an internal scholarship, maybe a department scholarship, and in the process, they see some external scholarships that they also match to and can apply to at the same time. So that's awesome, because they take an opportunity for one scholarship and turn it into multiple opportunities. And then another thing that we hear from students often, and I think we already touched on it, is that being able to understand how to track and know what's happening with their scholarships. So, so that's where they're looking to know what's happening with those scholarships. And then on the staff side, which is equally important, because you want to be able to manage that efficiently and effectively, we're looking at being able to make those scholarships work. So as a staff member, we want to know how to utilize unique criteria so that we can find the best candidates for those scholarships. Again, we're looking to be able to spend that donor money. And so by doing that, we want to match the students that are best suited for those scholarships.
Excellent. So we have another poll for you. Oh, sorry, I want to jump ahead here. So here are the benefits. We're doing a lot of polls today, so sorry about that. What are the benefits of a one-stop shop? So on the campus side, as you can see, the University of Arizona is quite large. And all of these departments, colleges, campus has scholarships of their own that they were managing before these best practices were in place. The benefit here is that there's a continuity. So even though departments are managing their own scholarships, they have their own process, they're doing it in the same place, so it forms a common language. And that's also helpful. There's a lot of turnover in scholarships. So someone might leave their position, someone new comes in. They don't have to necessarily recreate the wheel and learn the process from scratch. They're not going to file cabinets. They're not having to reach out to multiple people. There's a record of what was done in the prior year. Another thing is if someone switches departments, which is quite common, they don't have to relearn the system. They've already used the system in their other department. They just need to know the process in their own department for managing those scholarships within the system. On the student side, the benefit of a one-stop shop. Before, 12 years ago, if you were a double major, for example, in electrical and computer engineering, you would have to go to 2 different departments to find out how to apply for scholarships and if they had them. Not to mention that if that student is very successful and was in the honors college, which also to find those scholarships, add to the fact. And lastly, that student wants to study abroad. So, a very ambitious student, and study abroad has its own scholarships in its own department. So years ago, a student would have to go in that scenario to 5 different places, talk to the right people at the right time. And I can tell you, when students came to financial aid when I was working there, we didn't know what all those departments were doing in all those processes. So it's really transformative to bring them under the one-stop shop model.
Absolutely. And just to add to that, so we had a situation at the U of A where we had a college that hadn't quite joined Scholarship Universe, and they were surprised to find out that their students were actually using Scholarship Universe to get all of the other scholarships that were available to them. Not necessarily from that college, because they had a completely different process for having students apply, but they could go on Scholarship Universe and they were finding all of these other opportunities, which I thought was a pretty powerful thing to show them.
Yes.
So now we have that poll.
Now we have that poll. So what one-stop shop benefit is most important to you? Just another few seconds here.
And again, trying to pick just one is kind of hard.
And here are the results.
Ooh.
So the standardization and continuity, which I was kind of talking about here. So the common language, everyone understands the process, where to go, and how to do it. So great, thank you, everyone. So we're going to move on to our next best practice, drive student centricity. And what this really means is creating an extraordinary student experience. One of the things that I may have mentioned earlier is that student information systems are built not necessarily for students, they're built for the institution to get particular work done. We wanted to do something a little different. So we wanted to start with the student experience when we were building these practices and building up the technology. And what we actually did was we launched the external database of external scholarships that students would go in and start matching to. That was really transformative. And so what we ended up doing later on was bringing in the departmental process and bringing them on board, which Carrie kind of already mentioned here, another department learning. Students are already using this resource, and it makes sense to put your scholarships in the same resource. So that's what's driving student centricity, is really about putting the students first. So Carrie, what do students want today?
Well, ultimately, students want to get an education, and they want to do that with the littlest amount of debt possible. And so when you look at students and going through the process of getting accepted to college, enrolling, getting it paid for, and completing the degree, that is a long and arduous journey. And I am speaking from experience as a former college student, and it's stressful. And students sometimes don't know how to get through that journey, and sometimes they don't complete it. So when we were revamping how scholarships were managed at the University of Arizona, we took a big risk and we decided to put the students first. And that way, it makes the scholarship process easier. And believe it or not, that really paid off tremendously.
So here are the results from this approach and these practices. So as I mentioned, 75% of students have financial need. The addressable market, well, Scholarship Universe at the University of Arizona has reached 70% of UA students that use it annually on a voluntary basis. So they're not required to use Scholarship Universe. And we understand not every student needs a scholarship. So 70% is remarkable for a technology that students are voluntarily using. And they're also not just using it once in a while, they're highly engaged. So during peak season, which is typically spring, we see 20,000 page views of students logging in and viewing scholarship opportunities that they're matched with and applying. And then the ultimate result, which we're all trying to help with, is reduce overborrowing. So you recently did some analysis for last aid year, and you saw that scholarship recipients via Scholarship Universe borrowed 14% less than the average student, which is really incredible. So we have another poll. How would a student describe your current scholarship process? We have an option on here, I don't know, because maybe you really don't know. Maybe you haven't talked to students in a while. So it's really important to talk to them and find out what's going on, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. Oh, wow, I'm glad we put that one on there. That was a last minute addition, so excellent. So that's key. So that tells you if you're in scholarships and financial aid, that is an important metric to start identifying.
Mm-hmm.
So our third best practice is embrace technology. And as I mentioned, there's an interdependent nature to these. they're related. But if you're only going to implement one of these best practices or start with one of them, this is the one we would recommend because as hopefully we're demonstrating, it makes all of these other practices much easier to implement. Technology is what students are used to, and it just really helps in the process. So Carrie, we have some statistics here. Why do you think 97% of students say technology that helps them outside the classroom is just as important as technology in the classroom?
Well, the reality is that these students are tied to their phones at all time. They have their phones, their laptops, their mobile device, all those mobile devices with them, and they don't leave those at home when they step on campus. They're coming to campus from a one-stop shop world. They're just like you and me, and they're looking for mobile and convenient experiences. And they're shocked when they realize they have to go to 15 different places for the same thing. That's exactly what we're trying to avoid. And we don't want it to hurt engagement and find that students don't want to complete things because it's just not simple enough.
Mm-hmm. So here are some things that might have been burdensome before. So for example, the FAFSA used to be paper. Going to the bank, no one wants to go to the bank anymore. Waiting for a cab is arduous and no one's going to arrive. No one wants to go to the doctor's office. Carrie, do you like going to the doctor's office?
No.
Okay. So, and as scholarship management is a very difficult job. So some people just don't like working in scholarships with their current process. But now with technology, I can't remember the last time I went to a bank. Last week we had our open enrollment for benefits here at Campus Logic, and the presenter was talking about how he never goes to the doctor anymore. He just uses his phone through telemedicine, and it's actually cheaper for him. So he was recommending that. So you don't even have to go to the doctor anymore for routine checkups. And we're all familiar with rideshare like Uber and Lyft. And now we have finally arrived. There's technology for scholarship management. Thank God for that. So technology is really making a difference. So how is technology being utilized at the University of Arizona?
Well, at the U of A, technology was embraced by the U of A and Scholarship Universe utilizing adaptive matching. So what does that mean? So students create a profile and answer some key questions that really help them to match to scholarships that are most relevant and beneficial to them. And they can use their smartphone to do all of that. I was just at a FAFSA help session at one of the high schools a few weeks back, and there were students there that preferred to fill out their FAFSA on their phone rather than using the laptops that were being provided. And that's just the world that we live in today. So what happens when the students are more engaged on their mobile device? The result is that the students are continuously matched to relevant scholarship opportunities, and they're matched to vetted internal and external scholarships at the same time. And this kicks off kind of a domino effect, a positive domino effect. And it helps shorten the applications because the eligibility is determined upfront by those matching questions. And then you can use the applications for more qualitative measures like the essays that the students write and things like that.
So we have some more statistics here, and I'm going to talk about the one on the right here. So you might be familiar with this phrase, the coming apocalypse or the enrollment cliff. So 57% of four-year public schools didn't meet their enrollment targets on July 1st of this year. I think the trend has been over the last years, enrollment has been on the decline. And the cause for that is there's lower fertility rates. I think 2018 was the lowest fertility rate that we've had in the United States. This decline has been happening since 1971. So that just simply means that there's less students being born today that are not going to be enrolling in schools in the future. So everyone is facing sort of this challenge and speculating how to deal with it and what's going to happen. So you can't control that. You can't control state appropriations. You can't control the economy. There's a lot of things that we can't control, and there's a lot of pressure on institutions to do a lot of things today that they probably didn't have to do years ago to help students in higher education. So one of the things that we think you can focus on is the students who have already chosen your institution. So we see here on the left that 40% of low-income students never enroll the following semester due to financial confusion. And there's 3 million students dropping out every year. So focusing on those students and getting them access, like in that total addressable market of students that have that need, providing them the resources like scholarships and using technology, which is what students are used to, meeting them where they are, is really something that we think you can control and focus on and will make a difference.
It's really a win-win situation.
Yes. So we have another poll. Which one technology benefit would your students want most?
And we know they're all good. That's why we gave you the all of the
Yes.
above, because they're all very good.
Just another few seconds. Yay, all right, all of the above. So yes, they're all important. And hopefully we're demonstrating that here today. So we're on to our fourth best practice called create transparency. So little analogy here, I fly Southwest Airlines quite frequently, and they have these napkins during the in-flight service with little games on them. Like one is a word search, and there's a saying that says hidden words are better than hidden fees, which is kind of clever. And then they have a tic-tac-toe game that says we don't play games with our fares, just on our napkins. So to the point is that we're all consumers and we all appreciate transparency. There's information that we want to know, and we get frustrated when we can't get that information. And this is true for students today. Students have turned into consumers of higher education. They have to evaluate the cost of education, how they're going to pay for it. So they need this information. So Carrie, maybe you can lead us about the student experience.
Sure. So when you talk about students heading into that college experience, it is scary. You know, there's a lot of unknowns. They don't know if they're going to fit in the college life, or if their classes are going to be too hard, or if they're even going to be able to pay for their tuition from semester to semester. So we want to look at how we can make some of those things not so scary. And one of the things that we don't want students to have to stress about is whether or not they're going to be able to find scholarships. We've heard students say that, you know, that financial piece is so important that the scholarships could really bridge that gap. So what I have heard from students is that their biggest frustration is that they put in the effort to fill out the application, find the scholarships that they think are the best fit, fill out the application and submit it, and then they never hear anything back. So our students understand that scholarships are competitive, right? Everybody's looking for that extra money. And so they're not expecting to get every scholarship that they apply for, but what they do expect is to have a way to understand and see what's happening with that scholarship process. They want it to be a simple process and one that kind of informs them of the potential awards that they might get, and then what the result was. So they need to make sure that the scholarships are relevant and that they know where they're coming from.
So constant communication is key. And Carrie, I believe you have a story to tell about how important the communication piece is.
Yeah, so one of the things that we really like about being able to reach our students in a mobile environment is the immediacy of them getting those notifications. So in my job, I read over our thank you letters that our students submit and then make sure that they're appropriate before we forward them on to our donors. And I had a thank you letter from a student that just was really impactful to me. So we had awarded her a scholarship and sent a notification that she needed to complete a thank you letter in order to get the scholarship. And in her thank you letter, she wrote that she was walking to class and got a notification on her phone, a text message, that she had a to-do item on her Scholarship Universe platform. So she logged into Scholarship Universe and was shocked and surprised to see that she'd been awarded a scholarship. And she actually said that it stopped her in her tracks and brought her to tears because she had been stressing out about how to pay for school. Her thank you letter explained how her family situation was a little bit stressful with finances, and that this scholarship was really going to make a huge difference, not just in her college career, but also in her life. So that was one way that I could see how that immediacy of being able to get those notifications right to their phone made a huge difference.
It's a very powerful story, an important one. And it also ties back to what we were talking about earlier, how students are sort of pouring their hearts into these essays, hoping someone will read it and help them. And they may not tell anyone else, but when a student does that and they become vulnerable and put themselves out there, and they don't know if someone has read that essay, they don't get notified where they are in the process.
Right.
Has a decision been made? I'm left hanging here. Hello, I put in the effort, I applied. Please tell me, did I get the scholarship or not? Students appreciate that. So we're going to move on to what are the benefits of transparency here. And so to demystify process, students can see all the opportunities available, as we mentioned. I know early on when we were rolling out these practices, some departments were not used to showing scholarships to students, and they had this real fear that students were going to come knocking on their door, tell me why I didn't get the scholarship. But that never ended up happening. Students appreciated the transparency that we were providing them. Commonality, building trust, students start to understand the process every year. It's the same for them. So that just really helps, and transparency is really key. So we're on to our last best practice for the hour is measure everything. And the old adage here applies. You can't manage what you don't measure. So we have a poll for you. And so we practice what we preach here. So we are doing a lot of measuring on these polls. So what type of scholarship data is a struggle for you to get? So do you have trouble finding out how many students would be eligible for your opportunities? Do you know how many students have started your particular applications but didn't actually finish? How are your committees doing? That's usually a big problem. Just manually emailing, hey, are you done? Tell me when you're done. Not having the ability to just log in and see that data. Unspent funds. And here's one that might seem like an intangible: student engagement in the process. Interesting. So yeah, so this kind of relates to the poll we had earlier, not knowing what students think about scholarship, the scholarship process. So again, the student engagement piece is really important. So one of the things, of course we did surveys at the University of Arizona, and we built into Scholarship Universe feedback mechanisms to get good feedback to students in the process. But we also did focus groups. Sometimes just having a conversation with students, you learn a lot. There's things that students will never email you, but it comes out in a conversation, something you assumed that students thought or knew and you realize they didn't. So that's very powerful. So here are some things that you might want to start asking your team if you want to start measuring. How many students were matched but didn't bother applying? Now, if you don't have access to that data, it's still a good question to ask. One thing that it might point to is if students are dropping off, maybe your application is too long or complicated. So for example, I've seen a lot of applications that have 2 or 3 recommendation letters. It's important to consider students may not have 2 or 3 references, but they have tremendous financial need if you were to read their essay. So they might not be even allowed to submit the scholarship application. So that's one thing to consider is the application. What is student feedback about the program? As we mentioned, the matches, which is really important. Where are your funds being spent overall? Is advancement getting too many funds for a certain major or program? But you have a huge pool of students over here that are being neglected and don't have access to funds. And the last one here is, do some scholarships have 2 specific criteria? And so one of the benefits of these practices and the technology that we have access to all these 70% of students using it, and this technology and the system pulling in this data, we can identify if there's actually going to be an applicant for a scholarship. So maybe you can talk about that.
Yeah, so at the U of A, we discovered that we had a few scholarships that we were not getting applicants for, or very few applicants. And we had to look at those specs and figure out what was going on. And what we found was that the donors had placed these very specific criteria on these scholarships. And I mean, we have 40,000 students at the U of A. And when you see that 70% of our students are using Scholarship Universe and you don't have one applicant to this scholarship, that tells us that maybe that applicant doesn't exist, at least not at the U of A. And so what we did was we went back to our foundation and asked them to work with the donor to see if maybe we could change those specs and make them a little bit more open, because we clearly have the students that are looking for the funding, just not with that specific criteria.
So the power of data is important. It's important to start somewhere. You don't have to have a ton of data to start asking these questions. The key is just to start somewhere and get the conversation going and building on that and forming that partnership between the foundation and financial aid and all the stakeholders on your campus. So I think we have about 10 minutes left. We're going to open it up for questions. So we have, let's see here. Do you add the external scholarships? So Carrie, maybe you can answer this one.
So what we do, we have external scholarships that come in from a lot of sources. Sometimes the scholarship itself, the scholarship administrator will send us an email and say, can you advertise my scholarship? Sometimes departments will get scholarship opportunities, external scholarship opportunities. And so with our partnership with Campus Logic, it's nice for us because we don't have to vet those scholarships. I send those scholarships over to Campus Logic. They have a dedicated team that reviews those scholarships, vets them to make sure they're legitimate. And ultimately, if it looks like it's a good scholarship that will benefit our student and that it's open and able to apply, they will post it on Scholarship Universe for us.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, we have a team that's dedicated to that, and they review it every single year to make sure that information is up to date. So that just comes with Scholarship Universe. So we have another question here. It says, how did you get students to know about the system? So that's a great question. So how do you market it? So we identified all the touch points that existed on campus where students were coming. So admissions, orientations, and the admissions portal. As departments started coming on board, they were telling their students to go in and apply for their scholarships. And then those students were learning about other opportunities. And sort of spread from there. Another thing that helped was the naming of the system, Scholarship Universe. It wasn't just go complete this general application. It was a memorable name, so it became easy to market and promote. You can promote it on your offer letters, letting students know that you have this resource available to them. So creating that awareness was something that was really helpful.
And to add to that, also with our outreach program with all of our high schools in the area, working with those high school counselors, and they talk with their juniors and seniors about opportunities at the U of A when they express interest in going to the U of A. And so once those kids get accepted to the U of A and they're able to log in, they can start searching for scholarships right away. So some of those students already have some scholarships in hand before they ever step foot on campus.
Yeah, so that's an incentive to enroll students sooner and get them single sign-on and so forth, because we actually have a question is the process different for prospective versus current students? And so yes, it is. So U of A has a fairly early admission process. I think it starts as early as August, September, October. It's pretty early. I don't remember the exact month. So those students, before they're several months out before they even step foot on campus, they're applying for those incoming scholarships from externals and from departments that have them as well.
Right. Now, when they are asking about if the process is different, so everybody's going to access the same system. And, we work really hard to have scholarships that are just for incoming freshmen, which is nice because that's a cohort that we really want to make sure that we're taking care of. So those students are going to match to those scholarships as opposed to the students that are returning students who've been using Scholarship Universe regularly.
Let's see, we have another question here. We've never used texting before. What can you notify a student with text messages? The system, essentially every automatic email notification that exists in the system can be replicated with a text message. And you have the option to turn either of those off. So if you don't want to use certain text messages and you want to use certain emails or vice versa, you have the ability to flip those and edit those messages so they work with your institution and your process.
And we find at our institution that having those text messages on for all of those same notifications really works best for our students because that's where they're going first. They do have an option to opt out or opt in of the text messaging. But just looking at our student data, most of our students want that text ability.
So we have another question. Is there a way to see the system that the University of Arizona has? Good question. So this was a best practices webinar. This wasn't a demonstration of the system. If you'd like to see the best practices in action, you can feel free to, if you're already a customer of Campus Logic, feel free to reach out to your contact. You can just go to our website and request a demo. You feel free to reach out to me. Anybody really, you can reach out and talk to us and request a demo. We're also going to be at FSA in Reno. If you didn't enjoy listening to me today, don't worry, I won't be there, so I won't dissuade you. But our team will be there and they would love to talk to you about your process. So if you'd like to see Scholarship Universe in action, we would love to show that to you as well. So to be respectful of everyone's time, I think those are all the questions we have for today. So again, thank you, Carrie, for joining us today, and you're taking the time out to help everyone here. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. And we look forward to talking to you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.